Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Hello everybody out there, and welcome back to Spin-Off Sideshow, the Just Add Monsters show that takes a look at the weird and wild offshoots to some of the biggest franchises around. As always, I am your host Jordan Black, and with Crash 4 coming to Switch, PlayStation 5, and the Xbox Series X very soon, I wanted to take a look back at the handheld history of the series. While many people know that Crash Bandicoot started on the PlayStation 1 and have fond memories of it all the way through the PlayStation 2 era, what you might not know is that Crash Bandicoot enjoyed a healthy lifespan as a series on Nintendo handhelds, primarily the Game Boy Advance and then the Nintendo DS. But being that this was the era of Crash Bandicoot and Spyro for that matter, where the two properties were owned by Universal Vivendi and were, let's say, occasionally lacking in some quality control, you won't be shocked to find out that this handheld era of Crash is no different. It's a sub-series with lots of ups and downs, including some of the best games in the series and some of the worst. And along the way, all sorts of bumps and bruises and weird offshoots. Now, normally we do an overwrought intro with a bunch of fun jokes explaining the history of the series, but with so much Bandicoot bashing and Wumpa washing, we're just gonna dive right into the marsupial fray, taking a look at 2002's Crash Bandicoot: The Hugh's Adventure on Game Boy Advance, developed by Vicarious Visions. One of the more impressive early outings for famous platformer series on the Game Boy Advance, Crash Bandicoot: The Huge Adventure is a good nexus of everything that made Crash memorable, managed to be fit down onto the diminutive Game Boy Advance. It's a game that you can tell Vicarious Visions took a lot of love and care in making. There's a lot of technically impressive moments, including entirely 3D running sections that use the Game Boy Advance's beautiful sprite art to some wonderful effect. Most of the game plays out over 2D, and as this is an early Crash Bandicoot game, the story, while entirely original, isn't necessarily anything to write home about. What you basically need to know plot-wise for this game and all the games moving forward is that Crash Bandicoot's nemesis, Dr. Neocortex, is back, and you need to collect a variety of crystals and stop bosses to defeat him, ultimately. Like the classic Crash games on the PlayStation, the gameplay takes place across a variety of different themed levels and worlds, alternating between different styles of gameplay like the aforementioned 3D sections, but mostly playing out in 2D. The 2D gameplay here includes all the Wumpa Bumpin', God, that's what I should have used earlier, action that you remember from those PlayStation games, including dynamite boxes, nitro boxes, even familiar enemies, and bonus stages. While the game is all sprite-based, it does a good job of emulating all the gravity and physics of those original PlayStation games, giving the game a nice weight that feels pretty tight on the Game Boy Advance controls. While it is overall a good game, it is far from perfect. I will say that the small screen size means that sometimes you're just going to end up jumping to a death you didn't intend, meaning that, a lot like the early Crash games that inspired it, this is a game based around trial and error. So in terms of revisiting it, know that going in because your mileage may vary. Also, these stupid bats in the first level, like Ninja Gaiden, we're talking Crash Bandicoot here, not Ryu Hayabusa. But thankfully the game does dole out a decent amount of lives, and with the fairly tight controls, frustration remains minimal as long as you're willing to take a death and go back to a checkpoint every now and again. For the hardcore Bandicoot connoisseurs out there, this is a game they've probably played before, but if they haven't, it's absolutely a fun little gem worth going back to, even to see it through for a couple hours. Oh, also it has this little Space Harrier-like section, but in terms of games trying to mix up homages to older games, this is certainly not on the level of a Bayonetta, but gameplay variety never hurt anybody, at least not yet. It's also a little bit hard to talk about this game without not rolling directly into the next game in the series, Crash Bandicoot 2 Entranced. While this has nothing to do with the original Crash Bandicoot 2, I don't know why they didn't just call it Crash Bandicoot Entranced, another Game Boy Advance joint that released the following year in 2003 and again developed by Vicarious Visions, Entranced takes a lot of the foundations of the Huge Adventure and successfully builds on them, delivering a game with a lot more gameplay variety, though it still does unfortunately fall prey to the same pitfalls as the original game, mostly relying on the limited screen real estate you have to deal with, sometimes meaning you're just gonna end up jumping to your death, whether you like it or not. Out of the gate, there is more emphasis on storytelling, with unique cutscenes, sprites, and a new fungus-ass looking villain called Entranced, who is, as far as I know, only original to this game. And I can't see why. Who could forget character design like this? Out of the gate, it is a bit more accessible of a Crash experience. You don't really have to get Crash's abilities. You kind of start with a double jump and slam, making it a little bit friendlier to returning players of the series. I will say that they replaced some of the running stages with these wakeboarding levels that are kind of hard to navigate. The background gave me a little bit of a headache, and the foreground objects are hard to tell how far you are from hitting them, meaning that sometimes you're just going to have to try these levels over and over and over again, which are pretty frustrating. There are some levels later with Coco that kind of take the behind-the-back 3D Space Harrier angle of the levels in the first game, where you're running from like space fire or something. These were okay, and as always, I can appreciate some good level variety as long as the levels themselves aren't bad. However, this game is not entirely a better package than the first one, mostly due to the inclusion of these Atmosphere levels, where Crash apparently is the only other fan of Fusion Frenzy in the world. Who knew? Who knew? Now, I haven't played all of the PS2 era Crash Bandicoot games, but I can only assume that these Atmosphere sections are cribbed from those, and they should have been left out entirely. The isometric perspective makes it really hard to tell what the level boundaries are, so you're just left to saunter through what are meant to be fast-paced levels, tiptoeing through this American Ninja Warrior course in this wireframe testicle like you're afraid of waking up the level's worst obstacles. The controls are finicky, there's a lot of unexpected deaths, and just because of the perspective and how the assets are aligned, you can't really tell when you might fall to your death versus what's a level boundary. It's like if somebody said, hey, let's make Sonic 3D Blast, but on the Game Boy Advance, and worse, and put it in the middle of a Crash Bandicoot game. I would say there are maybe just one too many desert themes in this game. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more level variety. Also, pro tip for the first boss, you can kind of just sit in the bottom left corner and wait for them to come to you. And the second boss just reuses the style of the dingo fight in the first game, so they're not really pushing anything in the boss battle arena. The next game in the series, Crash Nitro Kart, was released the same year by Vicarious Vision, and is a obvious Mario Kart knockoff? Clone? What do you even call this thing? Look, I'm going to be honest, I like CTR as far as the reboot that came out a couple years ago, but when it comes to Mario Kart, and especially this era of karting games, I have very little patience for the rubber banding BS they put in it, and this game has that up the wazoo. Wump the wazoo. Damn it, I missed another chance for a Wumpa pun. I will say that it controls great and looks phenomenal for a Game Boy Advance. The flat environments and fast pace just means you can sometimes end up losing because you clip the edge of a track or miss a boost pad. It's not fun for me to play as a single-player game, though I imagine back in the day I might have had fun playing on the playground with some kids if they had a link cable on hand. It's clear that a lot of work did go into this game, and there's a decent amount of content. There's even a full adventure mode where you can kind of select what team you want to play on, like this is Sonic Adventure 2. And the hub worlds are admittedly impressive. It's a technologically great package, and again, shows the dedication Vicarious Vision had to putting as much content as they could, at least in the early days of Crash, on the Game Boy Advance. I'm sure there are a lot of people who loved this game growing up, but the brief time I played it, I just could not be bothered to care. If you're going to go back and revisit one of the racing games, I'd fully recommend just sticking with CTR and maybe revisiting this as a pure curiosity to see what they could do on a Game Boy Advance, if for nothing else. Oh, also, there's a secret rhythm game that is terrible. Crash apparently gets trapped in a nauseating void that looks like it's made up of that one Doom texture you couldn't look directly at as a child, while a PNG of the game's original characters, Do Not Steal, wanders across the screen like it lost its way to the actual game. And, oh, the rhythm game doesn't actually play on the beat? This is called Crash's Rhythm Party or something, but this party sucks, Crash. Don't just stand there with that stupid look on your face. Do something to fix it. And if you were a fan of the Bandicoot in 2003, I really hope you enjoyed that party because it was probably the best thing to come out of the Crash franchise on handheld systems for a good long time. Next up is Crash Bandicoot Purple, Ripto's Rage, hitting in 2004, and again developed by Vicarious Visions. This was envisioned to be a 1-2 punch in the Pokemon style of releasing two games between Crash and Spyro on the Game Boy Advance that crossed over, except it doesn't really, and this is kind of barely a Crash game. In fact, it feels more like a minigame collection. After the first fairly impressive entries on the Game Boy Advance, this game is supremely disappointing to go back to, not only because of the lost opportunity of having Crash and Spyro in the same game, but just as a game in general. It starts off fairly promising, with graphics looking a little bit more like DK Country, and what could be a fairly good Crash level just dissolves to the fact that this is a minigame collection sandwiched between a 2D hub world. The problem is that the minigames are bad. They're unforgiving, unresponsive, and just boring when they do work right. Whatever technical mastery this team showed with the previous 3D sections is lost in favor of these banal, repetitive excuses for padding the length of a game that feels undercooked. There's a trading card system that does nothing, and PCs stand around with nothing to contribute. As the spin-off with Crash and Spyro, it's an incredibly disappointing game, but even as a Crash game, it completely fails to capitalize on what made the series work previously on handhelds to begin with. It's just so disappointing. They have these sections that are kind of like Tapper. They have these sections that are kind of top-down tank sections, but none of them feel like a Crash game. The only thing that actually feels like Crash are the 2D hub world sections, but those are so brief and intermittent that it's hard to even say that they really capture the series. And speaking of missing out on what made the franchise great to begin with, the next game on handhelds, particularly the Game Boy Advance, would be Crash of the Titans, hitting in October 2007. Developed by Amaze Studios, this is a rough approximation of the console versions of the game, where first thing you'll notice is, whoa, Crash. Hey dude, you're looking a little different there. The game kicks off the story with more static cutscenes, and oh, Cortex looks awful too. Okay, this is less of a platformer than just a beat-em-up, where the core conceit is to take over enemies by jacking them. It still has a few recognizable Crash staples like TNT boxes, Wumpa Fruit, etc., but it just doesn't have the same flow as a proper Crash level, and it feels sluggish in comparison. While I can deal with the switch to more action-oriented gameplay, unfortunately the combat itself is awful. It's strangely unresponsive, mashy, and has terrible hit detection. And enemies can just stun you and leave you in damage loops very easily, even on the first few stages. The game is also awful to look at, feeling cobbled together from a number of different art styles between the sprites, backgrounds, objects in the environments, and the skyboxes. It doesn't blend as well as the first two games, and between the visuals, controls, bland level design, and repetitive and pretty bad combat, I didn't stick around longer than a few levels. I couldn't see it getting any better than where it started. This is a game that probably shouldn't have been made, especially with the vastly superior Nintendo DS game. But before we get to that, we have to take a quick step back and talk about arguably the worst Crash game ever made. Releasing in 2006 for the Nintendo DS and developed by Dimps, Crash Boom Bang is a wretched excuse for a video game, let alone a Crash game. What is ostensibly supposed to be a Mario Party clone on the Nintendo DS is a unresponsive and boring game that really has nothing in common with the Crash name. And I get that Crash has had party games in the past and that they weren't very good, so why they continued trying is beyond me. The game starts off with this discount Spyro villain who only exists as an excuse to get Crash and his friends to find artifacts or relics or something. The story is told through scrolling comic sequences, but you won't care because it's all pretty bland.
And it gets worse.
Holy crap, how bad could it get? A minigame shovelware collection where you don't even get the benefit of things that resemble Crash gameplay. This thing honestly makes Crash Purple seem like a masterpiece in comparison, as you slowly wander around a crappy game board playing awful Mario Party knockoff games with the DS stylus. Although, the problem is it barely works and nothing about the main game is intuitive. It's lodged between 3 different screens and overloads the player with info and mechanics right out the gate. But worse than all that is the game will make you sit and watch computers play minigames. So you'll just straight up sit there and wait for computers to do nothing so you can get back to the awful minigames. I don't know which is worse, it's like getting a root canal while waiting to be waterboarded. On top of that, half the time you don't even need to play the game, it can just play itself. I literally left the last minigame on a board to total chance and won the entire match. I don't even want to take much more time on this game because I feel like it's already sucked enough of my life and soul away already in the time it took to record this footage. This game is absolutely worth just burying a ditch and never forgetting about. It should be put out in the desert like those ET cartridges. Let's just move on. Thankfully, Crash Boom Bang was not indicative of how the Nintendo DS era would entirely play out for the Crash series, because the first main entry on the Crash Bandicoot DS games, Crash of the Titans DS, is not only a marked improvement over the recent games like Crash Boom Bang and the version of Crash of the Titans on the Game Boy Advance, it's one of the best handheld Crash games I've played, even with the new gameplay mechanics. It has the updated, more action-packed God of War / Devil May Cry-ish combat that was prominent in the console games at the time, and it even has an upgrade and leveling system, but altogether, with the impressive 3D environments, this feels more like a classic low-poly Crash game than anything else since the 90s. The environments and graphics are phenomenal for this era of DS games. They're detailed with decent draw distance and lots of side areas to explore. There's even classic bonus stages that play in 2D, making it feel like the first true Crash handheld game since Crash 2. The game, while having some fun combos, is far from being a Devil May Cry. Enemies still power through some hits, and there is a lack of impact in the game's various animations, but the rest of the game makes up for these shortcomings by being genuinely fun. They even have these fun little sections where you play as Nina Cortex where you mutate enemies, and though these early games suffer from that DS era where everything needed to have touchscreen interaction, most of it's pretty unobtrusive and you can play the game without having a stylus at the ready the whole time. The biggest problem is that while the levels are impressively long, checkpoints can be few and far between. Oh, I should mention the animation work is also really commendable. It's full of the personality that made Crash so memorable to begin with. It's great to see another low-poly Crash game stay true to the franchise's origins, even if it is trying to do some new things. I fully recommend tracking down a copy of this game if you have a DS or a 3DS on hand, because it's just good fun, and honestly I think any Crash Bandicoot fan, whether you're a fan of Crash 4, older games, or all the way back to the 90s, should check out this game if you haven't played it. It's maybe one of my favorites in the series, just because of how much fun and personality and love and care obviously went into it. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the next game in the series. Where Crash of the Titans on Nintendo DS was a massive step forward, Crash Mind Over Mutant is a few steps back. Released in 2008 and under a new developer, Tosei, Crash Mind Over Mutant is disappointing to say the least. Gone is the impressive 3D level design, smushed back to a 2D perspective, but with a much more open level design philosophy than the Game Boy Advance games. While this could have been an interesting take, it's combined with a floaty jump that makes for a game that has things you'll recognize from Crash with none of that tight design. It feels more like an aimlessly designed platformer from the era of Bubsy or other weird Sonic imitators from the Genesis and SNES era. The jacking mechanic returns to combat, but it's so much worse than the previous game. Enemies don't stun as easily, and moving on a 2D plane, you can't really dodge their attacks as well. Where the prior game was kind of fun to mash through, combat here is super repetitive, and on top of that, you can get pretty easily stuck if you accidentally kill a mutant you needed to jack in order to progress past a puzzle. This is what happened to me on the first level. It's not a big deal, you can just move out of one room and into another and they'll respawn, but it is still a weird oversight and means that you're probably gonna have to die and eat a checkpoint because, man, they take so much damage. In fact, the combat as a whole is pretty bad. The inputs are unresponsive at the best of times, and enemies can just dole out so much damage, destroying Crash unless you completely try and cheese them all the time. I guess that's maybe just how you were supposed to get through the game? And it's not like there's even the same variety of mutants as in the previous game, and they all pretty much control the same. Oh, and apparently Crash can also get dizzy now, because, you know, Crash Bandicoot, not known for spinning for long periods of time, I guess, apparently. Graphically, the blend of 2D sprites and 3D models on static backgrounds looks pretty garish. If anything, this game just top to bottom feels more like a port of Crash of the Titans for the Game Boy Advance, but to the Nintendo DS. It's like instead of looking at the successful previous game, they looked at all the bad games that came out before that. But on top of all that, it's not even actually that hard. Outside of some annoying combat arenas, which feel incredibly padded because the game will literally lock your progression, it's almost as if they had to do that because they realized that most of the game, you can kind of just jump over enemies. Because the level geometry is so open-ended, there's no real reason, unless it's a puzzle actually stopping you from moving forward, to stop and fight enemies. I know Crash games are generally known for speed runs and running through levels, but this is kind of ridiculous. You can just straight up jump over most groups of enemies until you get to a point where the game says, no, actually you have to fight them. The one impressive aspect are the 3D bosses they use, but even those feel incredibly middling and by this point are designs and encounters you've seen dozens of times before. Even the graphic differences between the levels aren't enough to keep you going, and the massive amount of levels just adds to the feeling that this game was padded out and made in a really short turnaround. It's a bummer that the series had to end this way, because the previous game was so impressive and such an upswing from where the Bandicoot had been on handheld systems. But thankfully, despite some really rough waters in the mid-aughts, Crash Bandicoot is not only back and better than ever, but will soon grace the most popular handheld in the world, the Nintendo Switch. So, be sure to stay tuned here to Just Add Monsters for our Switch Mix, taking a look at the game when it comes out relatively soon, and let us know down in the comments below what you thought of our reviews here, and if you had played any of these games as a kid, if you plan on going back and revisiting them, or just what you think of where the Bandicoot sits in general. Also, what do you think of Spyro 4? That's definitely going to happen, right guys? Right?